They tied her to a post at high noon. No trial, no crime, just whispered fear and a rope that bit deep into her skin. The crowd watched, waiting for her to break, but when her son rode in, wearing a marshal's badge and carrying a noose of his own, everything stopped. What happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The sun leaned hard on the high plains, and Martha bore its weight like stone bear's weather. Her dress, once cornflower blue, had faded into the color of defeat, the fabric clinging damp to her back. Her graying hair clung to her neck in curled tendrils, but she did not lift a shoulder to brush it away. That was the first thing folks noticed. She didn't move, didn't shift her weight, didn't blink away the sweat that stung her eyes. She stood like the post itself, rooted, defiant in its own silence. A few children had gathered, curious and barefoot, standing behind their mothers' skirts. One girl, barely 10, whispered, "Is she gonna die?" Her mother tugged her back with a hiss, but the girl had spoken the question everyone was thinking. Not whether Martha was guilty, not what the law said, but simply, would she make it till nightfall? No one offered her water, not even the sheriff, whose hands shook when he looked her in the eye. He stood a little apart from the others under the awning of the general store, chewing the inside of his cheek and gripping his hat like it might anchor him to his job. He hadn't wanted it to go this far. But Edith Crawley and her circle had voices like knives, and when they used them together, they could cut clean through a man's will. Martha could see them all, not with her eyes. She'd stopped looking at them hours ago, but with the long memory of someone who'd delivered their children, stitched their wounds, and sat by their bedsides when the fever ran high. They had come to her in secret, trembling with shame and desperation, begging for the same knowledge they now called witchcraft. And now they stood watching her like carrion birds, emboldened by her rope-tied arms. The wind picked up in the late afternoon, tugging at her skirt, sending dust into the folds of her bodice. She breathed it in, let it burn. A man had once told her, "You breathe through pain, or you break from it." That man had been her husband, soft-spoken, long gone, and she carried his words now the way some women carried charms. And still, she didn't speak. Not when the preacher came and quoted scripture beside her. Not when a teenage boy threw a stone that glanced her shoulder. Not when they laughed. She only tightened her jaw and waited. Not for justice, but for something older. The silence that followed was a silence made of nails. It pinned every soul in Dry Creek to the spot, eyes fixed not on the noose now hanging limp from Samuel's hand, but on the line it drew through their own shame. He wasn't the boy they remembered, that thin-legged thing who used to run after his mother in the market, dusty-faced and barefoot. That boy had vanished in the war. Some said Antietam, others said Shiloh. Wherever he'd been, whatever he'd seen, it had scraped the softness from his voice and carved judgment into the lines of his jaw. Now he stood tall in a sun-beaten duster, star catching the light, weapon holstered but undeniable. The townsfolk watched as he stepped toward the sheriff, every footfall measured like the ticking of a funeral watch. Samuel didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His tone had the finality of a judge's gavel, the gravity of a casket lid closing. "This is what fear makes of you," he said, gaze shifting from face to face. "You take a woman who held your wives' hands through childbirth and you tie her up like cattle. You don't have a law here. You have whispers. You have weakness." Edith Crawley's lips pursed, but she said nothing. Not now. Not with that badge gleaming like truth itself. Her hand twitched toward her Bible, but her spine curled ever so slightly inward, as if her spine had grown brittle in the face of something greater than her pulpit poison. The sheriff made a show of clearing his throat, but his Adam's apple bobbed hard enough to betray him. "Marshal, we didn't mean harm. Just caution." Samuel's gaze snapped to him. "Caution," he echoed. "You call it caution when you let a crowd act like a mob? When you tie a woman to a post with no charge, no witness, no trial?" He took a step closer, voice still calm, but now edged with ice. "The law is not your excuse for cowardice. It is your restraint from becoming a coward." No one spoke. Not even the preacher, who suddenly found the dust at his feet more captivating than the Lord's judgment. Samuel turned then, not dramatically but deliberately, and walked to Martha. She had not looked at anyone since he arrived. Her eyes had been fixed forward, but not distant, anchored, as if staring at something none of them could see. He reached up with a pocket knife and sliced through the ropes in 2 clean movements. The fibers snapped with soft, pitiful sighs. Her arms fell, joints stiff, blood rushing back. She sagged slightly, knees loosening, but caught herself before she could fall. Her hand came to rest on his chest. No trembling, no tears, just a firm, quiet pressure. Her gaze lifted to his, and though her lips said nothing, her eyes whispered a story only a son could read. Not yet. Not here. Not for them. Samuel nodded once. Then he faced the crowd again. And this time, the fear was theirs. The noose on her gate swung gently in the morning wind, creaking against the post like an old hinge. The knot was deliberate, tight, symmetrical, cruel in its care. Martha stared at it for a long moment without touching it, then stepped around it as one might a snake on the path. Samuel saw it before she spoke of it, and the change in his face was quiet and seismic. Not rage, but something colder, focused, surgical. He said nothing as he took it down, coiled it carefully, and slipped it into his saddlebag. By noon, the sound of his boots knocking on doors echoed down the crooked streets of Dry Creek. He didn't ask questions, he made statements. Names were recited like scripture, voices that had whispered in shadows now dragged into the daylight. He spoke to shopkeepers who'd once smiled at his mother, to husbands who wouldn't meet his eyes, to wives who clutched their aprons like shields. He wasn't interested in apologies. Samuel moved like someone digging for rot beneath the floorboards, and rot he found. Deeds refiled under false dates. A parcel of land that mysteriously shrank when the Crawley family's fence crept outward. A midwife's testimony ignored in a land dispute that left her with half the acreage she'd been promised by her dead husband. But that wasn't the marrow of it. The marrow was fear. Not of Martha, but of what she knew. She had delivered half the town's children, had sat beside too many beds in the hush of night when secrets slipped loose. She knew which men had crept where they shouldn't, knew which stillbirths had never drawn a breath because they'd been silenced before they could cry. Her silence had protected them for years. Now it made them desperate. That Sunday, the air inside the clapboard church was stifling with sweat and shame. The preacher was mid-sermon when the doors opened with a creak that cut his voice in 2. Samuel stepped into the center aisle and walked forward, each step landing like a verdict. His spurs rang soft against the floorboards, 2 heartbeats behind every breath in the room. He didn't ask for permission. He laid a stack of notes and names on the pulpit and set the noose down on top. The knot faced the crowd like an eye. "Let me be clear," he said. "This rope was meant as a warning, but warnings cut both ways." He scanned the pews, men who'd laughed, women who'd whispered, boys who'd thrown stones. No one met his gaze. "I won't arrest anyone today, but I will be here, watching, writing." The preacher tried to speak but couldn't find a word that didn't tremble. Samuel didn't linger. He turned and walked out, the door thudding shut behind him like the lid of a casket. And the noose stayed where he left it, coiled on the altar, facing the congregation, silent as judgment. The air had changed in Dry Creek, though no one could say quite when. Maybe it was the way people lowered their voices near Martha's porch, not with contempt, but reverence. Maybe it was the pie left cooling on her windowsill, untouched by mischief. Or maybe it was just the quiet absence of cruelty, the slow retreat of a town ashamed of itself. The first knock came from Ruthie Miller, her hands wringing the hem of her apron, eyes wide and desperate. Her husband had taken a bad fall in the stables. The bone had pierced the skin. Martha said nothing. She simply rolled up her sleeves and followed. The next week, it was the undertaker's wife, begging help for a fevered daughter. Then came the schoolmaster, stooped with a bullet lodged too close to the spine for the doc to try. They came not because they liked her, but because she was the only one who didn't ask why they came. She stitched, brewed, whispered prayers into poultices and cooled brows with hands steadier than justice. She never reminded them of their silence. She never said, "You watched me suffer." She never said, "You let it happen." But they remembered. And that was enough. Samuel lingered through the thawing of winter, not to protect her. He knew she didn't need that now, but to see if dignity could take root in barren ground. And it had. He woke each day to the smell of sage and ash, to the sound of her kettle, to the soft rhythm of her sewing needle beneath the maple tree that cast its shade like a guardian. That morning, she worked a patch into a quilt, old fabric, something from a dress she hadn't worn in years. Her fingers moved with memory, not thought. He stood beside her, hat in hand. "They owe you more than this," he said, quiet. She shook her head, never pausing the stitch. "No, they don't owe me. I owe myself." He set the badge in her lap, not a gift, a transfer of weight. "They'll listen now," he said. She touched it, thumb tracing the edge. "And if they don't, I'll be back." She smiled then, the kind of smile born not of joy, but survival. "You always did carry your father's fire." "And you," he said, glancing at her bare hands, red with healing, "carry the whole damn hearth." When he left, she didn't watch him go. Instead, she stood and walked to the post where they'd bound her. She rested her hand on it, not in anger, but in remembrance. The tree behind her shivered in a spring breeze. Buds, pale and green, had begun to unfurl, some just as loud, but this was the kind that grows.